Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump directly to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen, which will reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have some loose ends that I have been tying up this week. I have a completed project. I have an update on my hand spinning breed study, and I'm finally back at work on the finishing of my vintage 1950s jacket. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me, I think, from my social media feed through the World War I National Museum here in the United States. I have talked about this museum in the past. They have a ongoing program. I don't know if it's every month, but it's periodically. They have a program that they call Mrs. Wilson's Knitting Circle. Mrs. Wilson refers to President Wilson's wife. He was president during World War I. She was a knitter, and knitting was, especially knitting for soldiers, was a huge global occupation for the 4 years of World War I. And so they often have speakers at the museum, but during the pandemic, they've been via Zoom. And so I have been to several of those. I haven't seen any recently, but this one really struck some interest in me. The guest speaker is Ellie Reed, who I have actually seen speak before. She is based in the UK, and she is doing her PhD, I believe it's her PhD research on British women's magazines. And the talk that I saw her give earlier this year was on that interwar period between World War I and World War II, when she talked about the different types of British women's magazines, the types of knitting patterns that you'd find in them, and the types of garments, and how knitting versus crochet was seen. It was a fascinating talk. So the World War I Museum has invited her to speak for one of these Mrs. Wilson's Knitting Group programs, and it is on YouTube. So I'm going to leave a link to that. Now, I haven't seen this version yet. I've seen Ellie Reed speaking about this topic in the past, and assume that if it's either the same presentation or that there is a lot of overlap. I really don't know yet. These talks tend to be about an hour in length, including questions and things like that. So if you are interested in this topic, you might want to enjoy that. I found it really interesting because I didn't know anything about British women's magazines. None of the names were familiar, and she even spoke to what sort of socioeconomic group would have purchased this magazine versus that magazine versus another one. And I have been curious about whether there was something similar in American women's magazines, but I really don't have the answer to that. But again, I will leave that link to the YouTube video down in the show notes. This next tidbit came to me either through email or through my social media feed. It's from the Knitting History Forum. They sent out this alert about an article that is, the magazine is, I believe it's called Textile History. I'll put the name of the magazine right here. I didn't write it down in my notes. What was important is the article that is published in this magazine, which is the Stocking Knitting Industry of Later 16th Century Norwich, which in the UK. And she has written articles previously. She's a real scholar on 16th century stockings, I guess in particular, or knitting at least, before 1600. She maintains the invaluable bibliography of the history of knitting before 1600 and has published other pieces on early knitting, some of which are included in the Knitting History Forum's select Knitting History reading list. So if you're a member of the Knitting History Forum, you could find out more information about that. but I will leave links to that bibliography of history of knitting before 1600, as well as to this particular post about this article where you can, read the abstract at least. One of the main points that the Knitting History Forum was making is that this subject is of popular interest, but there hasn't been much academic information or research on it, and so that is what Lesley has done. So I find that really interesting and thought you might as well. This next tidbit came to me from my YouTube subscription feed. So I subscribe to several people who do historical costuming and historical sewing and that sort of thing. I find that to be a really interesting parallel to my interest in vintage and antique knitting patterns. And I learned there's a lot of overlap in the textile world, and so I find that really interesting. And also because I began returning to sewing earlier this year. I've been on a hiatus this summer, but I got really a lot more interested in fabrics. And obviously, I know what wool is because that's my favorite thing to knit. But this was a video that made me question that I know what wool is. The title of the video is Wool Fabric 101 Sewing Supplies, and the YouTuber is Nicole Rudolph, who, as I said, does historical sewing. There are several people who live in the same area of Nevada, and she is one of them, and they're all friends. And I think that she is the one who did a master's degree like on shoemaking. Maybe that might be her, but regardless, she knows a lot about historic sewing. So she was talking about wool fabric, and she started off with a definition of wool that made me pause and go do some Googling because it surprised me. And that was that wool, the term wool can apply to a variety of animals in terms of the fleece. She was calling it fur that we get from them. And she mentioned like cashmere, which comes from a certain type of goat, mohair, which comes from an Angora goat, Angora rabbits, alpaca, I think camel she mentioned, and obviously also sheep. And so she was mentioning that, and she's talking about the qualities of different wool, she was talking about the sort of the general qualities of these fibers, as well as a little bit more specificity with regards to certain animals. And I just, it just kept going through my head that, well, on yarn labels, if you see the word 100% wool, I've always assumed that it was sheep's wool, and that what I really appreciate, and something that I've been looking for specifically over the past few years, is yarns or unspun fiber from specific breeds of sheep, because their wool can really vary, and the specific breed of sheep can have fleece that has qualities that are desirable in one way but undesirable in another. And so sometimes you'll see a yarn label that will just say 100% wool. Other times it will say Peruvian Highland wool or merino or extra fine superwash merino or something like that. So sometimes you get a breakdown of the wool. But if it's other fibers, they usually tell you the percentage of cashmere or mohair or alpaca or any of those other types of fibers. That is usually listed on the label. So I began to wonder if there was a distinction between that general label wool that comes from different animals, like the wool of the alpaca versus the wool of the sheep, and what might be on a textile label. And the only thing that I could find, well, I could find references to labeling laws in different countries. And because I live in the US, I was specifically reading the laws in our country. And what they seemed to imply was that you could specify percentage of, specialty fibers like cashmere or alpaca or something like that, that you were allowed to do that. You were allowed to break out the percentage. Like you had to say if it was recycled wool, what percentage of it was recycled. And you could be more specific about what type of wool it was. But it did make me wonder if something that was labeled 100% wool, if the assumption is that it's always sheep's wool, or could it technically be 100% alpaca? You know, there is something called the wool pool, where sheep get shorn and it gets sent to the wool pool. It all gets blended together and it gets used for carpets or whatever later. I have a feeling that you know, alpaca and llama and cashmere and whatever don't get mixed into that wool pool, but I don't know for sure. I would suspect that there's an overabundance of sheep's wool relative to other kinds of wool, and that other types of wool wouldn't be included in the wool pool, but I really don't know. And I did post a question on the Wool Channel in their forums, and I got a couple people who were also interested, but no answers yet. So if any of you know, not just guessing, like, well, it's probably this, and like if you know, if you can cite some sort of a reference, I'd really appreciate it. But the video is very interesting because she does go through different types of fabrics and how they're woven and the characteristics of them, so that because things can be labeled in different ways, and that's been something that's always stumped me with sewing. When they give you a list of fabrics that would be suitable for your pattern, a lot of times I don't know what some of these fabrics are, and a lot of times that label could indicate fiber content, but a lot of times it's indicating how it's woven, how that fabric was created from fibers, and not necessarily what the fiber content is. So if you're interested in that, I will leave down in the show notes a link to that video on Wool Fabric 101. This tidbit came to me in my Ravelry group. Somebody posted, started a discussion thread in my group. She had come across the term Hap and Hap Stretcher, and she provided some links, but she was curious to know more about what those terms meant, what these meant. And so there's some lovely people in my Ravelry group community who were able to fill her in. So a hap is sort of an everyday type of shawl that someone on the Shetland Islands would wear, rather than one of the really fancy laced ones. It's like the everyday one that you would use to keep yourself warm. And when it's washed and blocked, they use this frame that has pegs on it, and the hap or the shawl is stretched on this frame by having loops around those pegs. So I'm going to leave a link to both the discussion thread so you can see the various links and that people were talking about, but also there's a blog post I found that has a bunch of different photographs showing like how you would put a hap onto a stretcher, the process of going through that. Kind of reminds me of the process of upholstering a chair, where you start in the middle on one edge and then the middle on another, and you know, you go and then you start working your way out in order to get an even distribution of stretch. So if that is of interest to you, those links will be down in the show notes. This final tidbit actually came to me from my daughter. She sent me a screenshot of a text message that she had gotten from a friend. This is my daughter who lives in the Netherlands. She has a friend over there who was traveling through Belgium and picked up a book, and the book is called The Threads of Life by Claire Hunter. And she sent a screenshot of the book cover, and Nina's friend said, I picked this book up and I thought of your mother. And so Nina thought that I would appreciate it. So that book has several different covers. I don't know if it has to do with which country it's published in, or what edition, or whether it's soft cover versus hardcover. I'm not sure, but there are several different covers. And I'll leave a link, an Amazon link, down in the description. But I got curious about, well, what is this book? And the description is that it's a globe-spanning history of sewing, embroidery, and the people who have used a needle and thread to make their voices heard. So I was reading a preview. You can read a preview of it on Amazon, and I was reading about it, and she was discussing this. It's a piece of embroidery that's very long. It has like dozens of panels, 60, 70 panels to it, and they call it a tapestry, but it's not technically a tapestry. It's technically an embroidery, and it is on display in a museum in France. It's called the Bayeux Tapestry, and so I'll leave a link to the museum that houses it, because they have a really nice way to look at it virtually online, look at all the different panels, and you can see what it's about. The book itself was fascinating, the topic, and is interesting to me, but then just reading that one little snippet and then finding this museum that houses that piece of embroidery, and then being able to look at it and learn something about the history of it and the people who likely made it and what the context of it was, and all that was really interesting. So I will leave links, again, as always, down in the show notes. So whenever I start a new project, there are a couple of things that I automatically do. One is that I go to my Ravelry notebook and I create a new project page. And so I give my project a name. If there is a pattern that I'm using, I will link to that source in the pattern database. I link to what kind of yarn I'm using. If I know what needle size I'm using, I put that information in. And then there are notes that I can make about what I'm planning to do, or what I have done, or what my gauge is, or all kinds of, maybe if I'm making a pair of socks, I might put in the measurements of that person to remind me of what I'm working with. So I do that, and then another thing I do is I create a spreadsheet. I've talked about this a lot of times, and I will link to other Casual Fridays where I have discussed what I use these spreadsheets for, how I use them, how I construct them, that sort of thing. As I work my way through the project, I like to keep track of my progress, like what percent of the way I'm done. And so one of the things that the spreadsheet does is I calculate the total number of stitches I have, so that I actually know truly what percentage of the way complete that I am. And then theoretically, when I am done with the project, I will put in my completion date, which I typically do pretty frequently. But then I need to upload a project photo. So sometimes I'm uploading photos as I'm in progress of certain aspects of it, so that I have a photo. But sometimes I don't, especially with socks. A lot of times I just wait until I'm done and I put the photo up. So what I was noticing as I was putting in some information on a new project that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, I was thinking, geez, I'm missing project photos for most of the things that I have knit this year. I should really make an effort to update those project photos. So a lot of them were socks, and I couldn't necessarily tell by the name I gave my project what the socks were. Like, I couldn't necessarily remember them. I was looking at the name of the yarn, I couldn't remember. And so I would, one of the things that you can do is put the color number that you are using for the yarn. So I clicked on that, and then I could see what the color was. And I went, oh yeah, those socks. Why? I don't remember seeing them in my sock drawer. I sort of remember knitting those, but I don't remember seeing them, and I don't know where they are. So I went down, I checked my sock drawer, and I did not find those socks. I did find, though, a pair of socks that I knit a couple of years ago where I hadn't woven in the ends. It's like every time I wear these, I go, oh yeah, I forgot to weave the ends, and they just shove them down. So I brought these socks upstairs. And I thought, I'm just going to weave the ends in on these socks and see if I can, look around my office and figure out where these other socks are. Well, I have a bin that is about this size that fits in one of these cubes, and my desk is made up of a unit that's very much like this. It's one of these IKEA units. And so I have a bin in my desk for works in progress. And when things go in there and I don't see them, it's out of sight, out of mind. So I opened that bin and I thought, I wonder if I put the socks in here for some reason. Why would I do that? And I looked through there and there were so many pairs of socks, completed socks that didn't have the ends woven in. All these socks that I've knit this year, I have tons of socks in my sock drawer. I probably have 30, 35 pairs of socks. So it's not like, oh, I complete a sock. Thank goodness I'll have something to put on my feet. I have lots of socks. So that was one of the reasons. And this year I've been doing a lot of toe-up socks. Sometimes I'm knitting one sock in using one construction method, then knitting a different sock with a different yarn. So, you know, I haven't been knitting a lot of completed pairs, but I knit more than I thought. So I went through and I wove in the ends of a bunch of socks. So this is, I think this is the pair I knit first this year. And it has this toe. It's a garter stitch square toe. This is a toe up technique. I did a video on this technique. So you are knitting a square of garter stitch where each side has 1/4 of the total number of stitches that you're going to need for your foot. So you don't have to do increases or anything. You do have to pick up along the edge of the thing, but you're not having to do increases. You don't have to start with just a tiny number of stitches and try to work in the round on those. You start out with a square and you just work from there. So that was like a new technique. It was a technique that you can't really do cuff down, and I needed an incentive for working socks toe up. So that's what these socks were. These were a little bit thicker yarn. They're like a 6-ply instead of a 4-ply weight. And then I used the heel that I used for cuff down on this. So it's using a new toe, a thicker yarn, so you get through the socks. But I never did weave in the ends. So now those ends are woven in. I did weave in the ends on these. These are the socks that I knit 2 years ago when I was running the August Sock Knit Along, which is a tutorial for custom fitting socks to your measurements and then being able to modify the heel of your choice based on your measurements, figuring out where your finishes are going to be and that sort of thing. So while the August Sock Knit Along was going on at the time, I was knitting these socks right here. So like I said, I've worn these a few times. But because I hadn't woven the ends in, I don't wear them very often, but now I'll be able to wear them more often. So these socks, I actually don't know if I knit these this year or these might have been knit last year because I think these were, yeah, these were knit cuffed down, so I must have knit these last year. This is a yarn that I bought in the Netherlands a couple of years ago when we were visiting my daughter. And so these have been sitting in my office for at least 1.5 years, waiting to have the ends woven in. And then I have this pair. Is this cuff down or toe up? This is also cuff down. So these must have been knit last year as well, and have been sitting here waiting. So I wove in the ends of these and I took pictures of all of them. And then this is a sock, this is the knee sock that I knit, a full knee sock I knit just a few weeks ago. And it used more than 50% of the ball of yarn. And my goal with this was just to see if I could get a knee sock that fit me correctly and would stay up, and what I would need to do to construct it in order to do that. So I figured that out with this, but I knew I didn't have enough yarn to knit the second one. And I decided I'd really like to have a matching pair, so I had to hunt the internet for this particular colorway. I could find it in Europe, couldn't find any seller here in the US. This is a, I think this is a Regia 6-ply yarn. So I found a seller in the UK and I ordered another. So I'm gonna have a lot left over. I actually would have enough left over to knit a regular pair of socks or something else for my grand niece to be. So I'm having a lot of fun knitting for her. So I might just keep doing that using the leftovers. Her big brother got some things knit for him using leftovers from socks that I had knit for my brother and his wife, so the baby's grandparents. I'd knit socks for them, and then I used those leftovers to knit things for Rosie's big baby, or big brother. And so I might knit her something from my leftover sock yarn. I think that would be fun. So I fully completed the Christmas stocking I've been working on for my niece, or my grandniece to be, who's going to be born at the end of November. What I've made stockings like these, everybody gets their own color combination. I've made stockings like these for my nephew, his wife, their kids, my niece, her husband, her son, and now her daughter, when she's born, will have her own. Everybody has their own color combinations. So one of the ways that I finish off the stockings is I line the stocking with fleece fabric. And I chose fleece, I think initially, because it was what I was used to doing for mittens, lining mittens with fleece. It just made sense. It tends to come in a lot of colors. It has some stretch in one direction, but not much at all in the other direction. So I like the stretchy part to go this way. And if the seam bursts for some reason, the fabric isn't going to fray or ravel. You would be able to close that seam again if you needed to. So I just think it creates a nice finished look. And the way that I decide how to do the lining, what size to do the lining, is that I just trace the outline of the stocking. And I cut that out, and then I seam 1/2 inch on each side, so you lose some of that width. You trim the edges pretty close to the seam, and then it will just slide right into the stocking. Now, when I'm tracing, I trace using a Sharpie onto the fleece, and because I want to make sure I don't get Sharpie on the stocking itself. It's kind of a two-step process. The first thing I do is trace it onto paper. You could do cardboard. Like if you wanted to just do one tracing one time, if you're going to knit a bunch of stockings and you just have that pattern for doing your linings, you could do that. I always lose track of it, and so I just do a new one, and that helps in case the stocking is a slightly different size. So I do use the Sharpie when I trace around the paper onto the fleece, but I don't want to get Sharpie on the stocking itself. So I'm going to go to an overhead and show you what the inside of the stocking looks like and how I do the final finishing details inside the stocking. So I wanted to give you a close-up look at the finished stocking because I've done the lining to it. What I do is I line with fleece, like poly fleece, and then I sew some double fold seam binding. So double fold seam binding is this kind where you have this center fold, but then it folds over again. So I encase the edge of the fleece right here, and I sew the bottom edge of the seam binding to the fleece. And then I sew the top of the seam binding to this undersided edge right here. Now, ideally, the seam binding and the thread would be a good match for the fleece, which in turn would be a good match for the stocking. So I think the fleece does a pretty good job. I bought what they had at the store. So you can't always get exactly what you would want. And so you get what you get and deal with it. I prefer having a thread that's darker if I can't get a good match. In this case, you'll see that I used two different threads. I have a darker pink thread here, and then I have a light pink up here. This is a standard sewing thread like you'd use in your sewing machine. And the thread that I am using up here, there are a couple of names for it. There's one brand called Woolly Nylon, but it's basically a nylon thread that's kind of fuzzy and stretchy. It's used in sewing for knit fabrics because it will stretch with the knits. So this is the kind of thread that I like to use when I'm sewing a woven item to a knitted item. So there is sometimes a fear that a regular standard sewing thread at some point is going to cut through the strands of the yarn. Since this is the very top of the stocking, and you know, as things get put in the stocking and there might be some weight pulled on it, I do that. It might be overkill. You don't have to use seam binding. You don't have to use any kind of lining. It's just something that I like to do. And then I use both colors that I use for the Latvian braid up here to do an I-cord loop that can be used to hang the stocking. The past couple of months, I've been working on a hand spinning fiber breed study. I bought a kit that has 30 different breeds, 1 ounce of each, combed top from Wool Gatherings on Etsy. I'll link that below. I've been spinning a couple of, it's been varying. My original plan was I was going to spin 1 breed per week, and then once I got into it, there were some weeks when I spun 3 or 4. Many weeks I'm spinning 2. This week I just spun 1, but it was very fine singles, and so there was a lot more spinning. This was number 17 out of 30, so I'm a little bit more than halfway through. And so I'll go to the overhead and kind of show you this yarn. It's so squishy. I just love this so much. So let's go to the overhead. I spun only 1 yarn this week, and it was Polwarth. So I was looking forward to this because when I was in Santa Fe a couple of months ago, I went to a shop there and I bought some sock yarn that was made from Polwarth, which I had never heard of at the time. And we don't have any Polwarth sheep here in the US. I think they're originally bred in Australia, so they're in Australia and New Zealand. And like many breeds, they were created by breeding merino sheep with another breed. So I think they're probably end up being like 3/4 merino and 1/4. I can't remember what the other one is. It's a very soft fiber, and it's very easy to spin. I really enjoyed spinning it, and it's fine. And because it was so fine, my singles were very fine, which meant I ended up with a lot more yardage. Just so much more yardage. And the 2-ply yarn is a finer yarn than I've been spinning so far as well. I'm just really pleased with how this feels, how squishy it is. One of the things that I've really come along in my spinning that's pleased me is that the yarn that I'm producing feels nice, like it's usable. I mean, some of the breeds are things that are coarse and hairy and very long, and they don't have any crimp or anything, and I don't necessarily want to spin with those again, but I am learning to spin a yarn that's not like rock hard. When it's done, there's some bounce and softness and squishiness to it. And so I'm not completely even and consistent with my spinning yet, but I think, I can only focus on one thing at a time, and getting used to how my wheel, what I'm feeling, and understanding what that sensation is when I'm spinning. If there's an issue, I'm like, oh, I know why it's doing this, and I could fix it right away instead of being puzzled for a while and not understanding it. Previous to this, when I started this breed study, this is the bobbin for my spinning wheel. I have a Lendrum, and when I bought it, it came with 4 of these bobbins. And so you spin your singles until they fill up, and then when you ply them, you're using singles from multiple bobbins. That's typically what you would do. I'm only spinning 1 ounce of fiber, and 3 of my bobbins have fiber on them from other projects from the past few years. I haven't moved those singles to storage bobbins. I do have some storage bobbins, but so when I started this breed study, I only had 1 bobbin. So that meant that I needed to spin the entire amount of singles onto 1 bobbin, and then I had to find a way to ply it that allowed me to ply it all from the 1 bobbin. So I've been using 2 different methods. One is to do something called chain plying, which allows you to create like a 3-ply yarn. It's like doing giant crochet loops to create 3 strands that are then twisted together. The other method is to create a 2-ply yarn by using each end and starting at the 2 ends and plying that together. And the way that you do that is by winding off of the bobbin onto your hand using a technique called an Andean bracelet. And there's a few different ways that you can wind this around. So you're winding all of the single around your hand and until you have it all there, and then you slide it around your wrist. And so you have a loose center pull ball. So you have the tail from the inside and the tail from the outside. When you are pulling a strand from the center and then one from the outside and they're coming off the ball this way, one of them is unwinding in this direction, clockwise. And so if this is unwinding clockwise on the outside, that means the one on the inside is unwinding counterclockwise. And so when they come off in this direction, one of them is going to acquire more twist and the other one is going to lose twist. And that's just because of the opposite directions that these are twisting. And so I don't love the effect of that. I think the Andean bracelet, because it's a bigger center of the ball, you don't get as bad an effect as if you actually have something with a smaller core like this. But I wanted to try plying from 2 separate bobbins, but I only had the one. So since I started my bead study, I bought another set of 4 bobbins. So as I was spinning my singles for this, I'd gotten approximately halfway through. I just, it was approximately, I didn't know exactly. And I thought, oh, I have these other bobbins. I'm just going to spin the other half on a second bobbin. So that allowed me to actually ply from 2 different bobbins, and then they were spooling off this way, which means neither one of them was getting any new twist. When they come off this way, like you do off the end of a ball this way, they either gain or lose twist, but when you come off sideways like this, you don't gain or lose. So I was able to ply until one of the bobbins ran out, and then I just had some singles left on the remaining bobbin, and then that's when I used the Andean bracelet technique, which is, my understanding is that's what they actually do in the Andes. They don't use that Andean, some people call it Andean plying. It's not their typical way of plying. It's a technique that they use sometimes when they're in the situation that I was in, where I was plying off 2 bobbins and then I ran out of one, and so then I used that technique to complete the plying for the rest of the skein. So I really liked this Polwarth, and I could see spinning with it again. I'll see how I feel about this particular yarn. It's not 100%, even, but I do like the way, even though I'm not perfect yet, I do like the way the plied yarn looks more than I did when I did everything from the Andean bracelet. So it's been a few weeks since this has been featured on my channel. This is my 1950s vintage jacket. It has 3/4 length sleeves. It has this collar. It's got interesting diagonal pockets, and it has a really interesting garter stitch triangular detail along the raglan seam line. I seamed the side seams and the sleeves a few weeks ago, and then it was time to sew the collar on. So this was a challenge. I'm used to laying things flat on a table when I'm seaming it, and this collar was really challenging. It was knit separately. It wasn't, you didn't pick up stitches around the neck and then knit your way out. Instead, this outer edge was the cast on edge, and then there's this these mitered corners for the collar. So that's going on, and then there is shaping, gradual binding off and shaping around the neck in order to get a better fit. So one of the things that can be really nice about vintage patterns is that you can get really nice shaping for neck for necks, like shawl collars and things like that. But they have to be sewn on, and knitters these days don't tend to want to do that. And so things like shawl collars have been simplified to allow knitters to pick up stitches perpendicularly to the edges and then use short rows. I don't find that the results in those kinds of collars are as nice as they are if you knit them vertically and then sew them on, but it's a pain. You have to, it's a pain to have to do that. But that kind of shaping, that kind of construction allows some more sophisticated shaping, I believe. So I had this collar, and I had kind of pinned it on, and I wasn't really sure, based on the shape of the edge of the collar, what landmark positions matched up with different landmarks on the body. And I was a little frustrated with that because it's three-dimensional. I couldn't really lay it flat completely, and I was frustrated by that. So last night I was trying again, and I thought, oh, I should just hang it on my dress form, and then I can see how it's hanging on a body, and then I can clip the collar to the sweater. I can see better. I can walk around it and see how it's hanging, and I can better figure out how this collar is supposed to attach. And it worked really beautifully, and I'll put a picture up here to show you what that looked like. So I was really happy with that. And then I was thinking, now how do I want to seam this? Do I want to start from one corner and then go around all the way to the other one or not? And so what I was doing, I was looking at it. I had it pinned up like this so that it was all clipped along here. And I thought, well, this is a really nice straight edge where it'd be really easy to do the seaming. I'm just going to seam across here first, do the back of the neck, and then see what happens. So I did that, and I'll show you another picture. This picture that I'm showing you, the stitches are joined, but they haven't been tightened yet. And then once I was happy with how that looked, then I tightened the stitches. And from that point, then I was able to seam along this edge. And I kept it on the model the entire time. It was right at eye level. The dress form is firm enough that it made it like it was a table surface. I just loved that process. And then I had to come around and sew this way. That was a little more awkward, you know, because I'm having to sew in this direction and I'm right-handed. But I was able to do it. But I was also able to figure out exactly how to line up this diagonal line of the mitered collar and have it join in along here, have it match up with the triangular garter pieces right here. It just made so much more sense when I had it sitting on the dress form. It made a huge difference. So there are a couple of more things that have to be done to this jacket. One of the things that I've already done is that the edges had to have single crochet along the pocket edges. And then there's no ribbing at the bottom of this sweater. It was just started with stockinette, and what's supposed to happen at the bottom here is also single crochet all the way along, and the lining of this pocket is right here. So as I single crochet along here, I will be joining the bottom of the pockets to the front as I go. So I need to do that, and I'm going to do that first before I deal with the button bands. Something that I've been doing on sweaters, cardigans the past few years, not on every single cardigan, but on some of them. In particular, I have been doing them for the vintage sweaters, is that I sew grosgrain ribbon to the back of the button band, and then I put buttonholes in the one that goes for the buttonhole band, and sew those on, and it gives that nice stability, especially for these types of bands that are garter stitch and they're knit at the time. Some people do short rows in their garter stitch to make things match up. I actually think, you know, garter stitch will block out to the correct length. It does want to pull up at the bottom, but if you have grosgrain ribbon that's woven, it doesn't, you can have the sweater band or the button band sewn to the grosgrain ribbon and have it maintain that edge. And one of the things I like about that is that it gives a little bit of weight to that front edge and some structure instead of being floppy. I just really like that. Well, I didn't really know how to do this. And so I've gradually over time kind of come up with a way that is working for me and refining it as I go. The mistake I made last time, I think this was with my World War I sweater, was I laid the sweater flat and I measured the grosgrain ribbon for the button band. And I made sure that the one for the buttonhole band was exactly the same length so that the two bands would be the same length, that I wouldn't end up with one that was stretched longer than the other one. I wanted to make sure that those ribbons were the same length so that when it was sewn to the bands would be the same length. And that worked. The problem was I did it when the sweater was lying flat. So then when I hung it up, it maintained that length, but then the weight of the rest of the sweater came down a little bit. So the band actually ended up a little bit too short. It functions fine. I didn't want to unpick it out and redo it and redo buttonholes, and I didn't want to do that. It was just a lesson learned. So this time, I just kept this after I did the collar. I kept it hanging on here and measuring the grosgrain that way. I realized, oh, I need to finish the edge before I sew that on. So I'll be doing that single crochet first, and then I will probably just make sure I've got that bottom edge is completely level, and so that I can get this front edge to match, and then that have everything absolutely even. And have it be perfect. So I learned something new each time. Every one of these vintage projects teaches me something that I didn't know before, which is really the whole goal of this project of knitting a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s, is to learn something new and to select projects and finishing techniques that are going to teach me something new. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.